This is Houston, contact with a test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of test. Okay, we checked all 4 systems, and there you go on modulation, all 4, and keying was a go. Roger, you're locked. We're here also.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. Blue moon, you.
The moon artwork that I've made is 7 meters in diameter, and it's a sphere. And when you see it in a darkened room, people don't know what it's made of. It looks like someone has stolen the moon, shrunken it down and put it into a room, and it's just there sort of floating. And people come up to me and they say, oh my God, how did you do that? Is it made of concrete or is it made of fiberglass? Because it looks like it has all this amazing texture on the outside, every last crater, valley and detail, all defined in perfect detail. So there's this sort of optical illusion that's created that makes people feel like it's a real moon that I've presented in front of them. We installed the Museum of the Moon artwork in the Wills Memorial Building, which is this beautiful hall at the University of Bristol. It's an extraordinary space with beautiful architecture, a big sort of wooden arched vaulted ceiling, and we had about 20,000 people who turned up over a weekend to come and see it. It was amazing, and everyone was lying all over the floor, moon bathing. I've been working with Dan Jones for a number of years, and so I commissioned Dan to make this piece of music inspired by the moon and its interpretation.
I thought it was extraordinarily beautiful.
Weirdly emotional.
And the clarity of it, actually, the clarity.
I thought it was absolutely mesmerising. Lying underneath it felt like
I hadn't really expected that.
And yeah, it was amazing to be able to be in the same room as the moon.
It was really nice to see it.
I think it's stunning. I think it's stunning. It takes your breath away. I'm totally emotional by it.
Insignificant,
right? To be fair,
different ideas about living in space.
I don't want to leave it. Yeah, I could have stayed there for hours.
It made me imagine being an astronaut and floating around in space.
And we had 4 guys dressed in astronaut suits who just turned up out of the blue, and they arrived and walked in slow motion and then lay underneath the moon bathed for a few hours and then left at the end. That was really nice to see as well. We had a small sort of 5 or 6 year old child who came up to me, and she said, she asked me if at the end of the art project whether I'd put the moon back. So I did sort of say, yeah, absolutely, I'm definitely going to put the moon back. So she obviously thought I'd stolen the real moon.
Oh, it's great. It's a bit spooky, but I like it, yeah. Is it a hologram, or is it a piece of art?
Is just a balloon with a light inside. The idea for the Museum of the Moon really came about when, living in Bristol, I was cycling over the river to work, and I sort of noticed that the tidal levels of the river were changing dramatically hour by hour, and sometimes there's just banks and banks of polished shiny mud, and then other times all that is completely hidden and you've got the water. It looks like the river's about to flood. And I found out actually that Bristol has the 2nd highest tidal range in the world. And it's the geography of the landscape, but it's the gravitational pull of the moon that's making that happen. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice to try and make an artwork controlled by the moon? and it led to an artwork I created called Tide. But also there was the seed of the idea to make this beautiful replica of the moon as a sort of inflatable. I've been working with a company called Cameron Balloons in Bristol, and they're the world's largest hot air balloon manufacturers. I spent many months finding the data, finding the imagery that would be printed onto the surface of this balloon. And we finally found it from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission from NASA. So it was a really nice process, to see a printer producing this imagery, and it's all sort of coming out of a printer about the size of a caravan, with these craters and valleys sort of pouring out from underneath this giant machine. It provides me and everyone else the opportunity to go round the far side of the moon, which we never see from the Earth, and see every last detail and crater on that side, and it looks completely different to the moon that we see from Earth. I suppose the other reason I was thinking about making a moon was that I always wanted a telescope as a child, but back then, telescopes were these very expensive things, and the nice thing about a telescope, it allows you to sort of get closer to the moon and the night sky. So by making the moon sort of 500,000 times smaller and making my own miniature artwork, I can really focus on every last crater and every last mountain and valley, and it's all mine.
My name is Jay Griffiths, and I'm the author of A Love Letter from a Stray Moon. I have loved the moon from when I was very small. One of my earliest memories was being in a car with my brothers and my parents going home, and there was a full moon and a very clear sky, and I thought, as many children do, that the moon was following us, the kind of ghostly galleon sailing across the sky. But then I also had another stranger feeling, which was that I belonged there, that I had come from the moon, that I was the moon's daughter, which in a way we all are, because part of the mind is lit by moonlight. We're not just solar creatures, rational with a very rational, logistical sun. We're also guided by the intuition, the metaphor, the symbolism of the moon.
I grew up in a village called Randwick, which is near Stroud in Gloucestershire, and there, I suppose at night you are very much connected to the night sky. There's not many street lights around, and so at night, the fields, the woodlands, everything's pitch black, unless of course the moon's out, and then you end up with everything painted in beautiful silver light and huge shadows being cast, moonlight shadows. In a city you just don't see beautiful moonlight shadows anymore. They don't exist, whereas in the countryside, when everything's silver at night and the landscape is sort of black and white and silver, it's a beautiful landscape, and it's an extraordinary, different way of seeing the world, I suppose.
I'm James Attlee. I'm the author of a book called Nocturne, A Journey in Search of Moonlight, in which I followed my own lunar obsession across the world. I wanted to walk in the desert in Arizona by moonlight, and I was warned by people I met that I should really wear boots if I'm walking at night in the desert, but it was hot, and so there I was. It was full moon. I was wearing sandals, walking in the desert, and I saw a snake crossing the path in front of me. So I treated it with respect. I waited, and I watched the moonlight glinting on its scales as it wriggled across the path. But after a few seconds, what confused me was it wasn't getting any further forward. It carried on sinuously kind of rippling, but it wasn't moving. And so after a few more seconds, I picked up a stick to give it a prod to see what was going on. And as soon as I touched it with a stick, I realised that in fact it was a piece of wire that had fallen from a passing train. There was a railroad track through the desert. And what was happening was I was experiencing a visual hallucination. The extraordinary thing was, even though I knew it was a piece of wire and not a snake, when I squatted down and really stared at it, it still looked like a snake. My brain was telling me it was a snake. I've got a feeling that in our culture, the fact that moonlight is often associated with the uncanny and with the threatening is because at very low levels of light, we can experience these strange slippages, possibly between one method of seeing and another, between using the cones and the rods in our eyes. And these can give rise to strange experiences.
Going to Tunisia, and I took a ride on a camel into the desert. We stayed in a Bedouin tent in the sand dunes, and I remember waking up at sort of 2 a.m, and it felt like we were really on the moon, and the moon was in the sky illuminating all the beautiful sand dunes, and it was so quiet as well because the sand was absorbing all the any particular noise, so my ears were hissing with the noise, and everything was bathed in moonlight, and it really felt like I was on the moon. It's a very beautiful experience in the desert at night.
Where I live in mid Wales, when there's a really cold winter, the lakes freeze, and when the lakes freeze, I want to skate. But one night I realised that there was going to be a full moon. So myself and a bunch of friends decided that we would go skating by the light of the moon. And it was a clear, clear night. So we didn't just have the light of the full moon, we had starlight. And we decided that we would dress up in full evening dress. So we plundered the kids' dressing up boxes. We went to second-hand shops. The men had full evening suits and cummerbunds. The women had boas and long dresses and long skirts. And we lit a fire on the shore and put candles around the edge of the lake. And when I was skating, part of the delight of it was the mulled wine and my friends and our warm, tiny society on the shore. But part of the delight of it was to skate on my own right across the far side of the lake with the moon. So it was the frozen lake, the moon, and me.
Anyone who's walked in moonlight will know that the world looks a different place. And the reason for this is that the light frequencies in moonlight are different to those in sunlight. And also our eyes work in a different way in low levels of light. If you sit in a garden as the sun sets, you will notice that the colour leaches out of the flowers that are around you. And this is because our cones, which are the receptors at the back of our eyes we use during sunlight hours, are much more sensitive to colour than the rods, which are extremely sensitive to light. Normally we experience vision that's created by a combination of these two systems, but as the light decreases, we switch over to our rods and we enter a world that's almost like a black and white photograph as colour leaches from it. This enables us to see clearly the main shapes of things rather than the detail.
I'm colourblind, but that's given me a sort of passion for and an interest in visual perception and how we see. It means that all my paintings are really bad, but this passion for perception and vision and light, yeah, I've sort of followed that. It's part of my arts practice, and it's inspired lots of different artworks over the years. And I suppose in relation to the moon, you know, the moonlight itself is has a beautiful sort of quality to it. I'm based in Bristol, but I work both nationally and internationally. So I've sort of bypassed the whole London scene entirely to a certain degree. And I'm known worldwide really for a lot of my public participation projects. So especially for the street piano project, Play Me I'm Yours, that involves putting pianos on streets and in cities for the public to play. A few years ago, I installed a giant water slide down the middle of the high street in Bristol. I like the idea of, collaborating with specialists to enable art projects to come into being. A few years ago, in fact, I made my wife's engagement ring, and it's got my voice etched onto the outside of it like a phonograph. And you can play this miniature ring back. It's my proposal. It's a 23-second long message, and that's how I proposed to my wife. The first moon I made was presented at the Bristol Balloon Fiesta, and it was helium-filled, and it lasted for about 2 hours before it popped dramatically. It was a complete nightmare. I mean, I think that's the nature of doing anything new and learning any new discipline. It involves a certain degree of failure. You have to be willing to fail. This is after working on this art project for maybe 6 months. It was all a complete nightmare. And then, so the following day, you're looking up at the real moon, and it just felt like the moon was laughing at me, and it would make me sad even to look at anything that was possibly round. So I remember holding up an apple, thinking, "Oh, why does that make me sad?" And it was so anything round suddenly was really depressing. But now I've finally made this artwork and I'm touring it around successfully. Whenever I look at the real moon now, I feel like it's smiling at me, and I've got a nice relationship to it, and we're good friends,
At night, when the moon beckons, it beckons not only for our curiosity, but for our affection. And not only for the moon itself, but for one another. Love can fill our hearts, but also has the power and potency to span the depths of space and time. Like a new electromagnetic force of nature, with charges that only attract, magnetic poles that don't repel. The love that conquers the cosmos, our love, remains as boundless as the multiverse itself.
The moon has been presented in all sorts of different locations, both inside and out, and we've suspended it in the nave of Coventry Cathedral, and that was really interesting. And of course, when you see it in a religious context, people then think about it in relation to perhaps the creation of the earth and the power of God. But we've also put it in a beautiful swimming pool in France, where people were unable to sort of swim out underneath the moon, and they could lie on their back and look at all the details on the south pole of the moon. So the moon was literally about 1.5 meters above the water, and that was really beautiful. And likewise, we suspended it above a canal in Riga, and we had various canoeists who came out at night with their head torches looking up at the moon, and that was really nice. The moonlight reflecting on the water. And we had so many people that 2 or 3 of them fell in the river at night. It's going to happen, I suppose. So wherever it goes, the artwork gets interpreted in different ways, and people seem to fall in love with it. I suppose I've become slightly addicted to people enjoying my artwork. We presented the artwork in Marseille, and I'd arranged a large arc of deck chairs for people to come and sit there and gaze at the moon. And I went back after half an hour, and all the chairs had been put into couples, into sort of pairs, and there were couples in there sitting next to each other, holding hands, gazing at the moon, which was very nice. So, the moon in many cultures is quite sort of a symbol of passion and a symbol of, there's a sense of romance,
Without love of my own.
We had a beautiful Chinese dragon performing, all kind of covered in LEDs, steaming with smoke underneath the moon in Hong Kong. And that was there for the Mid-Autumn Festival, where the moon is really celebrated and a vital part of their culture.
For many societies, that close knowledge of the moon and a relationship to it was so important that different nights of the moon might be called different things, not just different names for the full moons, but actually for different nights of the waxing nights. For example, in parts of Indonesia, 2 of the waxing nights of the moon were called the Little Pig Moon and the Big Pig Moon. These were the nights which we, in the Western calendar, would call the 11th and 12th nights of the moon's growing. They were so called because these are the nights when the pigs and piglets get moonstruck. They're tickled pink by moonlight at night and squeakily overexcited. They bust out of their pens and go for a cavorting, giggly, piggy scramble in the fields.
Even though Japan is one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world, the moon is central to the culture in various ways. For instance, when I was in Kyoto and I visited the gardens of the temple at Ginkakuji, moon viewing parties from the royal court would go to the gardens awaiting the rising of the moon from behind a hill which was called Moon Waiting Mountain. And as it rose over the hill, the moon beams would illuminate a cascade that fell over the side of a small cliff, which was called Moon Washing Cascade. And they would eventually fall on a perfect cone that had been formed of white sand by the gardeners, kept its shape constantly monitored to keep it perfect. And this was designed to be seen by moonlight. And under moonlight, of course, the white sand glows in a particular remarkable way. The full moon is also reverenced in the autumn festival that takes place in Japan, known as Tsukimi, named after the Shinto goddess of the moon, Tsukiyomi, who lives in the moon with a rabbit who grinds rice for her. The festival is an opportunity for friends and family to gather together beneath the full moon, to appreciate its beauty and to also think of those who are not with them. There's a lot of Japanese art and poetry that visits this trope of looking at the moon and thinking of your home country if you're in exile, or thinking of your loved ones miles away.
The moon is always a companion to those who are alone, because the moon is always alone. It's a companion for the solitary, and it comprehends the lonely. It is a consolation. There's a beautiful thing that I've heard in many parts of the world when people will say when they're missing somebody. I've heard it several times between mothers and daughters that when they're missing each other, they're away from each other, and there's a full moon, that if they each look at the full moon, they can know that the other will be thinking of them. It's like a kind of messenger. It's also like a universal commons and something which belongs to all of us, that whenever there's a moon, you're never truly alone.
And I wondered how the same moon outside over this Chinatown fair could look down on Illinois and find you there. You know I love you, baby. I'm so far away from home. I'm so far away from home. Yeah, I miss my baby so. I can't make it by myself.
When we look at the moon in the west, we can see a man in the moon. And that all that is sort of a face that we think we can see, but it is just made up from the darker lava flow patches in the surface of the moon that we can see. But interestingly, if you go to different parts of the world, they see different things. In Italy, they see the two-headed god Janus, so they see two faces in the moon. Whereas over in China, the moon is orientated sort of maybe 180 degrees around, so when they look at the moon they can see a hare or a rabbit in the moon. And so yeah, different cultures, they see different things in the moon depending on their orientation and depending on their culture as well.
Probably my favourite description of a full moon is by the 8th century Chinese poet Tu Fu. In this case, wonderfully translated by the American poet Kenneth Rexroth. Isolate and full, the moon floats over the house by the river. Into the night, the cold water rushes away below the gate. The bright gold spilled on the river is never still. The brilliance of my quilt is greater than precious silk. The circle without blemish, the empty mountains without sound. The moon hangs in the vacant, wide constellations. Pine cones drop in the old garden. The senna trees bloom. The same clear glory extends for 10,000 miles.